This program has been made possible in part by Interweave, the handmade life, your craft community for books, magazines, videos, patterns, events, and more. On the web at interweavestore.com.
Fit is the most important quality in making a hand knit wearable. I'm your host, Eunny Jang, and today on Knitting Daily, improve your fit by taking good measurements and making sure that garments still fit even after you've made some big mistakes. First, on getting started, I have tips on fixing your knitting when you've made a piece either too long or too short. Then, Laura Bryant and Barry Klein joined Shay to share their advice on taking basic body measurements and figuring out ease before you start knitting your garments. Next, on our crochet along, Kristen and Marcy introduce us to the motif squares in the chain reaction afghan and the various techniques for creating these motifs. And finally, I have a dose of hard-to-swallow advice on fixing your knitting to ensure fit. When all else fails, cut and sew. So we've all had the experience of making a sweater, putting hours of effort into it, and then when we go to try it on for the first time, finding that some piece of it is either too long or too short. And you don't need to give up at that point. It's a pretty easy fix to go back in and lengthen or shorten it. We have three kind of scenarios that you might want to look at, or situations where that might happen, and the solution is different for all of them. If you have a sweater that's knitted from the top down, as in the sweater to my left here, which is knitted cast on at the neck and then knitted all the way down towards the bottom hem. If you need to make this body longer or shorter, because it's knitted in stockinette, or actually if it were in any pattern stitch, all you need to do is unravel the bind off row. Just pull out to where you want to go if you want to shorten it, and bind off again. If you want to lengthen it, just pick the stitches back up and keep on knitting. If it's knitted in the round, which makes this a lot easier, but if it's knitted flat, all you need to do is unravel your seams to the point that you need to get to, and then make sure that you lengthen or shorten all the pieces equally. If you come on in front of me, I have a little mock-up of a sweater here, which is just a very simple raglan style cardigan. The fronts and the backs are knitted from the bottom up in pieces. The sleeves are knitted in the round to the armholes, and then the raglan lines are seamed. And when you're knitting from the bottom up, things get a little bit trickier. You don't want to unravel your bind off row here and go all the way back to where you need to go, because that means ripping out almost the whole sweater. And if your sweater is 20 inches long instead of 6 inches long, that can be a problem. So there's an easier solution. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this sweater upside down, and these are my cast on rows, remember. And this is stockinette stitch, so things are pretty straightforward. In stockinette stitch, you have columns of V stitches. So these stitches that look like V's, you have columns of those, whether you're looking at it upside down or right side up. And these are offset by half a stitch, but in a flat piece, usually that doesn't matter very much. You can hide that in the selvage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to pick up what looks to me like the right leg of the V stitches running in this direction from this perspective. So here is a V, and I'll pick that stitch up. Here's another V, and I'll pick up the right leg of that one, and so on and so on and so on. So I'm using a double-pointed needle, a small double-pointed needle, but if you were doing this on a full-size sweater, it would make sense to use, for example, a small circular needle. So you can visually just check to make sure that you're in the same row for all these, and it looks like I am. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my little snips here and actually just snip out a loop of the row directly below that one. Don't cut into those stitches themselves, or all the work that you just spent picking up will have been wasted. And I'm going to snip another helper stitch. If you are very familiar with the anatomy of fabrics, you can pretty easily predict which direction will be easier to pull from, but a lot of times it's just sort of a matter of looking at where your yarn is running. So I'm working across my row. I'm going to pull out all this loose yarn, and we will hide all of this or work the ends in our seams later. And all I need to do here is if I wanted to shorten it, I would pull out my needle and I would drop back down to the place where I want to go. If I want to lengthen it, all I need to do, of course, is to attach a new yarn and get my right size needle, my correct size needle, and begin knitting. And my stitches are already in the right orientation on the holding needle because I picked up the right loops of the V's. So you can see that there's a slight offset. There's a full stitch here going the wrong way, but it becomes a stitch, half a stitch over when we pick up and knit down. But the join is otherwise invisible in the fabric, and we can just make up for that half stitch later. So that's stockinette, which is very easy to handle. In a fabric like a cable, where that half stitch offset would be noticeable, what you're going to want to do is pick up the right loops of the stitches as we did before. And it gets a little bit awkward in purl fabrics. You have to really look to see where your stitches are running, and in cable crosses, obviously. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we would continue picking up like this all the way across. And then when we unravel our yarn and begin knitting, we'll find again that all the stitches have been offset by 1/2 of a stitch. Now, the way that we can fix this or fudge this is by simply working compensating decreases or increases and sort of visually fudging it. You'll never be able to align them perfectly from a technical point of view, but we can make a visual join that's good enough. So I'm just going to unravel as far as my cable here so that you can see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to reattach my yarn, and I'm a half stitch off, but I'm not worrying about it in this stockinette portion. I'm just going to start knitting in the same pattern. Now here you can really see what I'm talking about. This is the stitch if we're going in the correct direction, but now that we're going this way, it's the other direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an increase just before, and then I'm going to make a decrease. And that sort of visually aligns that edge. I'm going to do the same thing here, where the cable stitch that I picked up is kind of half a stitch in from the edge of the cable. I'm going to make a decrease that leans to the right and then make an increase immediately next to it so that my stitch count doesn't get off. And you can see that it more or less has a good, clean kind of look to it. When you're working in the round, as for these little sleeves, things are even easier because the offset doesn't matter as long as you're working in stockinette, which is always the important thing to make this easy. When you have a cable or some other patterning, color work, anything like that, you'll have to get creative to hide it, but it's always better than ripping out a whole sweater. So on this sleeve, you would continue picking up the stitches all the way in the round, making sure not to miss one. And once you've done that, you can cut just above, pull out your yarn, and then continue working in the round, either to bind off to shorten, which is what we would have done right here, or just pick up and continue knitting to lengthen it. And if you follow these tips, then you'll never have to worry about sweaters that are too long or too short again.